Hello and good morning, everybody. A warm welcome to you all. Before we start, I have to let you know that we take screenshots and the whole lecture will be recorded. So if you don't want to be seen in the pictures, just switch off your cameras. And if yes, it would be nice to see many of your faces of all who are listening. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Martin Wall to you. Martin Wall is Head of Public Diplomacy, Press, Lender Coordination, and Climate and Energy in the Irish Embassy in Berlin. Prior to this, he was a Deputy Director in the Climate Unit in the Department of Foreign Affairs, as well as a Deputy Director in the Multilateral United Nations and International Financial Institutions team with responsibility for the World Bank. Before joining the Department of Foreign Affairs, Martin was a Marie Curie Caroline Fellow associated with University College Cork and Adelphi, a Berlin-based think tank with a focus on climate and security issues. Earlier in his career, Martin worked as the manager for an incubator for startup companies in the marine and energy space. Now, besides all these different exciting activities, Martin also holds a PhD in history from University College Cork, and his thesis focused on Ireland's relationship with the then European Economic Community in the 1970s. Now, we are all very much looking forward to your talk, Martin, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. I hope you can hear me okay. Good. It's a real pleasure to be here this morning and joining virtually. Unfortunately, I've never been to Wuerzburg, although that will change this summer when I'll visit, I think on the 14th of July and meet some people down there. So I'm really looking forward to that. And I just want to say before I begin, a huge thank you to the Irish Studies Centre here in Wuerzburg, and particularly Professor Bergman and Professor Eisenman, as well as all the team and everybody who put this together, because I know that a lot of effort goes into making these lectures happen. So thank you very much. And I must say, Maria, listening to my own career read back to me is a very strange feeling. Maybe it's inspiration to students that you don't always need to have a direct path to where you're going, but you can do many different things along the way before you decide on what your career is, and there's always space and scope to change. I'm really pleased to be talking to you here today about 100 years of, well, actually I've changed the title slightly from what was given, but 100 years of Ireland's foreign and economic policy. And I might just share my PowerPoint. What I would say is when I'm sharing my PowerPoint, all I can see is my PowerPoint. So if anybody wants to interrupt or get my attention, please just unmute and say something, and then I'll stop and respond. But my intention would be to do the lecture first, and then we do Q&A afterwards. Okay, great. Maybe some context about Ireland before I jump right into the lecture. I'm sure many of you are aware of this already, but there's 26 counties in Ireland, 6 counties in Northern Ireland. I'm from Cork in the south, just east of the city, but I know that Wuerzburg has a very strong relationship with Wicklow and Bray in particular. They're just below Dublin, south of Dublin. The population of Ireland is 5.15 million. That actually came out yesterday in a census. The report of the 2022 census came out yesterday. So that 5.15 million shows another increase in the Irish population in the last few years. And the Irish population is growing consistently since the 1960s. We had a population of 2.82 million in 1961, so we've almost doubled our population in that period. Interestingly, before the famine, which was in the middle of the 19th century, Ireland, the island, had a population of over 8 million. So we've not reached that figure just yet again, but we're getting closer once more with a population of 1.9 million in Northern Ireland. I would recommend anybody who has an interest in demographics and Ireland indeed take a look at some of the reporting on the census. It was really interesting. It showed the population was increasing, as I said, but for the first time in a number of reports, the population isn't growing as a result of births in Ireland and the population growing in that way. It's growing as a result of inward immigration, and that's a real change for Ireland, because Ireland has such a long history of emigration, people leaving to find opportunities elsewhere. So now we're a country that people go to. Also, what I thought was interesting from that census that came out yesterday was that the number of people who identify as Roman Catholics has fallen again in Ireland. So it was previously, I think, 79% in the last census, about I think it was 2016. It's now gone down to 69%, which is the largest drop in between two censuses that we've had. And believe it or not, 1,800 people in Ireland identify as Jedi Knights and have put that on the census as their religion, which is down from about 2,000 people who had a religion of Jedi Knight in 2016. So really worth having a look at that census if you have an interest. Capital city is Dublin. As a Cork person, you know, we always say Cork is the real capital, but I think that's just the people from Cork who say that, and nobody else agrees with it. But you do see some funny memes and things like that about Cork, calling ourselves the People's Republic of Cork and the real capital. I don't think any of my colleagues in the embassy would endorse that statement. Famous landmarks, the Cliffs of Moher, Newgrange. Actually, I have a picture of that. So you see Cliffs of Moher in the center, the Giant's Causeway in the top right, the Burn in the bottom right, Newgrange in the bottom left, and Trinity College in the top left. If you have a chance to visit Ireland, these are some of the places you might wish to visit, and they're very beautiful. Okay, to get stuck in, I mean, yeah, Ireland is a relatively new state. We're just over 100 years old, and this year is a real year of anniversaries for us. So it's 100 years since we joined the League of Nations in 1923. It's 50 years since we joined the European Union, or then the European Economic Community, in 1973, and it's 25 years since the Good Friday Agreement was signed in 1998. And I think, you know, across those different anniversaries, you can start to pull out some key themes in Irish foreign policy. That idea of, you know, an independently minded foreign policy, the idea of we're a small state, and what that means for a country when they're conducting their foreign policy. You know, things like having a larger neighbor, such as the UK, things like supporting multilateralism and a rules-based order, which you know, all small states are really keen to pursue, given how that can moderate relations between states and how important that is, so that we're not as some statesmen would say, you know, pushed around in foreign policy, but also the idea of peace being a central part of our foreign policy, as well as over the last 100 years how foreign and economic policy can become intertwined. I think that's maybe a place to start, and what I'll try and do in this section and the next section is to give a sense of where a background on the economic history, but then maybe go into more detail in the political history and the foreign policy history. I realize I haven't included my structure. Yeah, I haven't included my slide in the structure, but broadly, I'll look first at Ireland around the time of independence, so the few years before independence and the few years after, and then our foreign policy in the years after Ireland became an independent state, our history with the League of Nations, relations with Britain, and so on, before looking at the Second World War. Then I'll go after the Second World War, look at the post-war foreign policy of Ireland, where we had real decisions to make as to whether we would remain closed economically and closer with our neighbour, the United Kingdom, or should we pursue a more internationalist foreign policy and economic policy? And I think that the latter is where we came down very clearly. And then I'll look at the post-70s foreign policy with a focus really on a membership of the European Union, but also the issue of Northern Ireland and the Troubles before closing with a perspective on current foreign policy issues, including around Brexit. So in terms of the history of the Irish economy, a really brief one. I mean, at the beginning of the last century, our economy was largely unindustrialized and agriculture primarily. In the 1930s and 50s, we really did pursue a protectionist trade policy with a focus on homegrown industry and building up our own industry in Ireland, which meant that we didn't have the type of open trade policy that we're really known for today. I think in the 1930s that protectionist trade policy was quite common across the world and in Europe. But in towards the end of the 1940s and into the 1950s, it was clear that countries were moving away from a protectionist foreign policy to a more open trading or open trade policy. So I should say a more protectionist trade policy rather than foreign policy to a more open trade policy. So Ireland took a little bit longer to open up, and we'll see a bit more about that as well in the 1950s. And that opening up did lead to a boom in the Irish economy, a mini boom, maybe not to the extent that we had a boom in the late 90s and later, but quite a boom nonetheless, and driven by labor-intensive foreign direct investment. And then into the 70s, the global economy took a hit as a result of the oil crises and a global recession. So we had to deal with that. But I mean, so many of you will know this already, but Ireland became an independent state in 1922, on the 6th of December 1922. We'd been ruled by since the 12th century by the English and later the British monarchy, and Ireland was a constituent part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland through the Act of Union, which was signed in 1801. So between 1801 and 1922, it was known as the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, as opposed to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland today. And that's important, because if you looked at a map of Ireland in those days, there was no border between north and south. It was a single country, but what there was clear, I would say, clearly different perspectives on what Irishness meant. So for many people in the northeast corner of Ireland, and what became Northern Ireland, Irishness meant being part of a United Kingdom with Great Britain. That's how they would define Irishness, and it's part of this union. For others, and it's not quite as simple as everybody in the northeast thought that, and everybody elsewhere thought something different. But maybe generally speaking, people in the other parts of the country had more of a sense that Ireland should, at the very least, have its own parliament and a devolved government, and others who became more prominent throughout that period thought that Ireland should be an independent country. And that fight for independence wasn't a peaceful transition. It was as a result of violent conflict, and it was a reflection as well that efforts that had been made since the late 19th century all the way up and throughout the First World War, that Ireland should try and have home rule by constitutional methods hadn't worked, and so others decided to take up arms, and by and large had the support of the vast majority of the population by the late 19 teens and into the 1920s. So you'll probably know the history, but Easter 1916, there was a rising in Dublin, where a number of people took over key buildings in Dublin. This was right in the middle of the First World War, and it was a real mix of groups from socialists, Republicans, and others. And actually, for an event that has become symbolic of the Irish freedom movement, on the days itself during Easter 1916, a lot of people in Dublin were wondering what was happening, and why this was going on. And it wasn't until some weeks after the rising was put down and the leaders were executed that public opinion really turned in support of the rising and those who took part in it, and this idea of Irish freedom and Irish independence. And that followed through to December 1918, when the UK held general elections, and Sinn Féin, the Independence Party, became vastly the most popular party in Ireland, and took 73 seats. What they did then was they decided not to go to London to take up their seats in Westminster, the parliament there, but instead to set up their own parliament called Dáil Éireann, which means Assembly of Ireland. And that met on on the 21st of January 1919, and there was a declaration of independence, and in that declaration there was an acknowledgement of the international aspects of the independence movement, and they had this free message to the nations of the world. And this message emphasized Ireland's unique cultural characteristics, or geographic location as the gateway of the Atlantic, and called on every free nation of the world to support the Irish Republic by recognizing Ireland's national status and her right to vindication at the Versailles Peace Conference, which I'm sure you know is the peace conference that was set up at the end of the First World War to set out a new system for peace in Europe and globally. Along with the opening of the Dáil, we also saw the outbreak of the War of Independence. So you had the political movement, but you also had this more this more conflict side of the War of Independence. So on the exact same day, there was a British or the police. There was 2 police people shot in County Tipperary. I think it was 2, and that was the beginning of a guerrilla war which lasted for the next 2 years. And during this time as well, given the desire of many in the northeast corner of Ireland to remain part of the UK, there was a decision to partition Ireland to have a different devolved government in the north. The War of Independence led to between 2,000 and 2,500 casualties on all sides. So it was quite, it was quite a violent time, and many people lost their lives at it. But maybe just to focus on in Versailles for a second, this was a real moment in European history, and seen as quite a failure of diplomacy in light of what happened in the 20 following years. But there was great hope attached to the discussions at Versailles by a lot of countries who were seeking independence. And you must remember, at this time, you'd seen the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, you'd seen the collapse of the Habsburg Empire. So there was a lot of states looking for their independence to be recognized at Versailles, and we come to Versailles with the US president, saying that countries need to have their self-determination. He also spoke about how we have to prevent something like the First World War happening again, and come up with systems to do that. So Ireland sent a delegation to Versailles led by Sean T. O'Kelly, who later became president of Ireland. And this was a real awareness of the importance of foreign relations and how integral winning the support of the international community for the independence movement was. And like I say, we weren't the only one to send delegations to Versailles looking for support for independence. However, we weren't successful at Versailles in gaining recognition for that, possibly because the Republican movement in 1916 had aligned itself with Germany during that time, and I don't think there was huge sympathy for the Irish cause as a result of that. But it wasn't the only place where we sent people in this time. We set up propaganda offices in other locations, and future Prime Minister Taoiseach Eamon de Valera went to the United States to build support, and in Berlin, Nancy Vice Power came here and set up an Irish bulletin, which was produced every couple of weeks, and we have a copy of the original here in the embassy as well, which might be of interest if anybody ever visits or has the opportunity to visit us in the embassy. I guess despite that international outlook, of course, the diplomacy had to be at a certain point conducted with the United States, or with the United Kingdom, sorry, and the War of Independence was really coming to a stalemate. I mean, the guerrilla movement on the Irish side could never really defeat in a war the British, who had the might of the empire, but equally the British were very reluctant to come in with lots, and I mean they did send troops through different organizations, but they didn't send their army in to quell the revolution, and so neither side could really win the war, and so a treaty was signed in December 1921, which established the Irish Free State in the British Empire, so a similar status to Canada. And as part of this, Irish parliamentarians had to recognise the British monarch as the head of the state. And the treaty also included restrictions on the Irish military and the retention of 3 British bases on the island of Ireland. So we weren't really fully detached from the British sphere of influence, even though we did have independence. In Northern Ireland, then the remaining 6 counties had a devolved assembly remaining in the UK. So that resulted in the border in Ireland, and it was quite a lot of debate and actually resulting in a civil war in Ireland as a result of this treaty that many people of the independence movement were split. Some people thought that the fight should continue and Ireland should continue to seek the full independence. But I think that the argument that won the day, and a referendum was held which endorsed the treaty, was from one of the architects of Ireland's War of Independence, Michael Collins, who he said in supporting the treaty, this treaty brings the freedom that is necessary. It brings the freedom that we were all ready to die for. That is, that Ireland can be allowed to develop her own life in her own way without any interference from any other government, whether English or otherwise. So you'll see over the next number of years that many of the clauses in the treaty around the oath of the allegiance and so on were removed, and we'll come back to that. I think one other point that's of interest is around this time Ireland started appointing diplomatic representatives, and our first one was to Washington in the United States, Timothy Smitty. But what was interesting about him was this was a first for one of Britain's dominions as well, that a country would appoint a diplomatic representative in another country, and that had implications too for the Commonwealth and how that worked. I want to talk next about the League of Nations, which, as you know, was set up after the First World War with the view to providing a forum for states to moderate relations between one another, and this idea of collective security, that something like the First World War could never happen again. Ireland joined shortly after it was established in 1923. And it allowed Ireland to engage with representatives in an international forum through over 50, like engage with over 50 other states in an international forum in one location in Geneva. That's really important because at this time we didn't have something like the European Union or the United Nations where states meet on an ongoing basis and can speak to one another and and discuss issues that are cropping up between each other and collaborate and so on. So this didn't really exist at the time. These vehicles for discussions on an ongoing basis between states, and to have that a new state with one place where you can meet with over 50 states. I think that's, as a civil servant, really good value for money in that sense. But I think the League of Nations became a key plank of Ireland's foreign policy, which up until this point was a lot to do with relations with Britain, to show that we had a wider foreign policy and engaged in a broader scale than just relations with Britain. And there was two, I think, areas where we focused on in those early days in the League of Nations. One was to emphasize Ireland's sovereignty, which is, that Ireland was an independent nation now, and countries needed to be aware of that. And the second is this idea of a belief in the League's conception of a peaceful international system. And I think this was a real mark of confidence and optimism at a very early point of Ireland's statehood to reach out and join the League of Nations, and a demonstration of our belief in the equality of all states and in liberal internationalism. So it did become this key plank of our foreign policy, and really supporting international law and sponsoring moves for disarmament. And in 1930 we were elected to the Council of the League of Nations, which is kind of like the Security Council in today's United Nations system. Those years between 1930 and 1935 were Ireland's peak, I think, at the League of Nations, with the Taoiseach Eamon de Valera as Ireland's well, it was known then as the president of the Executive Council of the Irish Free State, but later called the Taoiseach after a new constitution was inaugurated in 1937. This was a really interesting time because Eamon de Valera was on the anti-treaty side during the Civil War, and one of the leaders of those who said that Ireland shouldn't sign the treaty and should continue its war of independence with Britain. So there was quite a bit of skepticism when he came into office in 1932 as to how he would what his vision for Ireland would be. But when and that vision for Ireland was to engage in the constitutional mechanisms of the state and very much as part of that constitutional setup, although he did then subsequently change it. But I think he was really the dominant figure of Irish foreign policy in the 1920s and 30s. And at the League of Nations, Ireland was really at the centre of major questions at the time, from issues around the League's mandates in Africa to public health issues in less developed countries, to the 1931 Japanese invasion of Manchuria. And actually, during this latter example, the Japanese invasion, Ireland's permanent delegate to the League supported efforts to penalise Japan for their transgression. And this was in spite of orders from Dublin not to do so, given Japan's role as a bastion of anti-communist stability in the East. And I don't think that would happen today, that instructions from Dublin would be disregarded by the person, the delegate in the permanent representation. So I think Ireland remained a really strong supporter of the League, but really after 1935, the League of Nations was beginning to stutter and not able to manage the big developing issues in international politics. And this really was made clear when Italy moved against Abyssinia, which is modern day Ethiopia, in 1935, and it really demonstrated the failure of collective security and undermined responsibility or undermined confidence in the league's ability to execute its function. And so in response, Ireland started to slightly withdraw towards greater self-reliance in international affairs. And I think there's a really good characterization or summation of this and a conception of Ireland's role as a small state in international affairs at this time, given by Eamon de Valera in 1936 at the League of Nations, where he said, all the small states can do if statesmen of the greater states fail in their duty is resolutely to determine that they will not become tools of any greater power, and that they will resist with whatever strength they may possess every attempt to force them into a war against their will. And I think that hints at Ireland's approach during the Second World War. I just want to say one other thing before we move to the Second World War, which is at this time there was about 50 people in the Irish diplomatic network, so it was really small. I mean, there's several thousand today, and the diplomatic representation abroad was quite small. We had Washington, London, and Geneva in the early 1920s, and then open diplomatic relations with Germany in 1929, along with the Vatican and Paris, and of course Ireland as a very much a Catholic country at the time saw relations with the Vatican as very, very important. The first ambassador to Germany you can see there in the picture was Daniel Binchi, who had studied in Munich and had even heard Hitler speak there as a student, and he was really concerned about the rise of Nazism. He was also fluent in German, and so that was a real asset for Ireland with him as our first ambassador. And just maybe to mention the Eamon de Valera piece again, and maybe some of the worries amongst some of the community as Eamon de Valera and his party Fianna Fáil became the largest party in 1932 in the Irish Parliament. It was Daniel Binchi actually resigned in 1932 his post because he had concerns about somebody who was from the anti-treaty side coming into office in Ireland, and I think those concerns were really unfounded ultimately. I just want to say something about Britain and relations with Britain as well during this time. I mean, in the 1920s, Ireland was a very much a reluctant member of the Commonwealth and made efforts to reform it. The Commonwealth being the countries who were part of the British Empire, such as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and others, and Ireland really tried to reform that as a member of the Commonwealth, and we had some success. There was the Balfour Declaration in 1926, which declared every dominion the equal of Britain, and the Statute of Westminster later, which ensured the sovereignty of dominions and allowed dominions to appeal laws passed in Westminster for it. And I think this was also underlining the importance of the diplomats in the Irish system as well, and really showing to the Irish system that there was value in diplomacy and having a Department of Foreign Affairs. On coming to power, though, de Valera did bring a new assertive approach to relations with Britain, and he downgraded the status of the Crown's representative in Ireland. He triggered a trade war with Britain that lasted until 1938, and initiated a new constitution that is still our constitution today. And at that time, it had something very important, and that was to remain very important right up until the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. And that said, in the Constitution, in its preamble, it said the national territory of Ireland consists of the whole island of Ireland, its islands and territorial seas. So the Irish Constitution at that time was making a clear and an open claim to the national territory, including both Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland as well. There's also an interesting piece to that from a diplomatic perspective, because technically the British monarch continued to accredit Irish diplomatic representatives overseas, and we'll see during the Second World War that Ireland, the previous ambassador had left Germany, and we had a new person ready to go. But because Britain was at war with Germany, and the British monarch needed to accredit Irish diplomatic representatives overseas, he couldn't sign the credentials for a state that he was at war with. So Ireland during the Second World War had a charge d'affaires as opposed to an ambassador, because of this reason. So I move on to the Second World War, but I just want to offer a chance for anybody who has any questions to come in at this stage. Otherwise, I'll keep going. No, I'll keep going. So,
I think
oh, sorry, yeah.
I think there aren't any questions at the moment.
Okay, great. So the Second World War, or it was also known as the emergency in Ireland at this time, because we had to ration and so on, and make sure that we could supply ourselves with what we needed. Given Ireland's perspective, as outlined by De Valera above, that question of small states, what is the role of a small state during a war, but also the relative size of our army, which was quite small, or fear about what it would mean for Ireland's independence if we did become a party to the war, and also, what would Ireland have contributed to a war of that scale, given our strength? I mean, what impact could we have? So for these reasons, Ireland did pursue a policy of neutrality during the Second World War and stayed out of it. There was very real fears that Ireland would be invaded, particularly during 1939 to 1941, when the Battle of Britain was taking place, and right up until the Nazi priorities turned to Russia. That fear was very real, and we later learned that they did have plans to invade Ireland as part of their proposed invasion of Great Britain, and we were spared this really because of British success and the British victory in the Battle of Britain, and the subsequent postponement of Germany's invasion plans. There was some concerns around whether Britain would retake some of the treaty ports. So you recall in the treaty, Britain retained 3 ports in Ireland, 2 in Cork and 1 in Donegal, I believe, that they would try and take those back, because Ireland faces the Atlantic and is strategically in an important place, an important position. But Britain didn't do that, and because they had also Northern Ireland, where they had military bases there too. Also, it was quite interesting that during this time, Britain's first diplomat was posted to Ireland, just given the need to ensure constant communication between both governments. So yeah, actually, and maybe just to add about Ireland's embassy in Berlin, I mean, it was a really difficult time. The Charge d'Affaires, William Warnock, who later actually became a fully fledged ambassador to Germany, did say it was really difficult in his reports back, and the Irish legation in Berlin was destroyed by an air raid in 1943, leaving, as Warnock said, little more than a typewriter. So it was a difficult time for diplomats posted in Germany as well. But despite this neutral status, Ireland did attempt to behave even-handedly to both sides. But by 1941, it was clear that neutrality accommodated limited and discreet cooperation with Britain. For example, if a German plane crashed in Ireland, its pilot was kept in custody throughout the war, whereas if a British or an Allied plane or person ended up in Ireland in this time, they were kind of secretly given back over the border to Britain. But Ireland did have this fear of invasion, and Germany's official position was that it expected Ireland to remain neutral, and that carried a threat within it, which was pretty explicit, that if we don't see that you're remaining strictly neutral, we will act. But and attacks did happen as well. I mean, Dublin's North Strand in 1941 was attacked, and Germany also transmitted messages into Ireland and had spies in Ireland, and so on. Now, by the end of the war, all these spies were rounded up, and their transmitter for radio messages was impounded. So Ireland remained successfully neutral throughout the Second World War, but was criticised by Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, in his speech during the Victory in Europe Day. And De Valera replied to this with his own broadcast, which reiterated some of the things that he'd been saying, almost a decade previously, when he stated that, a world in which small powers were to be subordinate to the requirements of larger powers was a world doomed to war. And I think, he was quite highly praised for this contribution, but also that was very quickly old news. This little spat between Churchill and De Valera as the world looked to building peace in Europe after the war. I just want to mention before we move on to the next section, three things that we can take from that and to look forward to Ireland's future foreign policy. So first was Ireland's contribution to the post-war relief program in Europe and taking in of people who'd suffered during the war. So in this time, Ireland used its food and other materials that it stockpiled during the Second World War, and sent them and made them available to Europe in the years afterwards. And for example, 3 million of the population of Hungary, of the total of 9 million population of Hungary, received 200 grams of Irish sugar, and Ireland sent the first non-Allied foreign supplies to the Soviet-occupied zone of Germany. And there's a really interesting book by Jerome Anderville, a lecturer in UCC, which looks at this this period in Irish history as we sent supplies to Europe in the aftermath of the war, and you see a lot of pictures with boxes and carts with Irische Spende written on them, the Irish donation, and it's really fascinating. I think Jerome is going to speak at the embassy in late June, early July. If anybody is in Berlin around that time, let us know if you're interested in coming. But also after the Second World War, more than 400 children from war-torn Germany came to Ireland under this operation known as Operation Shamrock, and they stayed. Well, by 1947, there was nearly 500 children between the ages of 3 and 15 that had been hosted in Ireland. So basically, they came and they stayed with families, and went to school and so on in Ireland during this period. And these children now are mostly in their 80s, and they formed really strong bonds with their Irish host families, and some even stayed in Ireland. And we were really honoured to have an event at the embassy some months back where two of the children who went to Ireland in this period came to the embassy and spoke about their experience. And it's really fascinating that they still are in touch all the time with their brothers and sisters, as they call them, and their friends who are still, who were born and live in Ireland, and they still are in touch, and they have this connection to Ireland. And I think this speaks to our later development program as well, that this is quite an important area for Ireland that we do continue to give and support development programming around the world through Irish aid. I won't actually speak too much about that later for reasons of time, but it is something that is very important to us. Secondly, the thing that will become important is this idea of multilateralism. Even though the League of Nations had really failed to prevent the war, a new organization, the UN, was established in 1945, and this will really become central to Ireland's foreign policy, and still is. We were not a founding member of the UN in 1945, but we did apply to become a member the following year. Our application was vetoed by the Soviet Union, that year in 1946, and it continued to be vetoed right up until 1955 when we did become a member. The Soviet Union did say, they were vetoing Ireland's membership on the grounds of our wartime neutrality and our lack of representation in Moscow. More likely than that was because with the Cold War brewing, Ireland was seen as a natural ally of the West, and 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 that was pretty much accurate. Ireland was intellectually Western, anti-communist, um, but this absence from the UN up until 1955, and the fact we didn't become a member of NATO, um, meant that we were a little bit out of the loop, let's say, a bit of a remove from events up until 1955. And then third, this in the years after the war, this issue of European integration was becoming more and more important and began to pick up pace with the establishment of the Organization for European Economic Development, which is now the OECD, as well as the European Coal and Steel Community, which then turned into the EU later, and this really led to a debate in amongst Ireland's policymakers as to whether Ireland should look to stay very close to Britain in political and economic matters, or should we be more international in our outlook? And this question was really decisively answered in the following years, although not immediately, I would say. So going into the post-war period, as you recall, Ireland had the Irish Free State was founded in 1922. The Constitution of Ireland was written in 1937. That was really led by Eamon de Valera, and that named Ireland the country Ireland, or in Irish, Éire, which actually is, well, I'll come back to it in a second, but that does cause confusion sometimes as to what the name of Ireland is. So in this period, 1948, De Valera was out of office, although he'd come back very soon. And the constitutional status was pretty set. Ireland was a member of the Commonwealth. Officials participated in meetings of the Commonwealth at a time when there was not too many opportunities to participate in multilateral meetings. But there was also a sense that Ireland was waiting to see what happened with newly independent India before deciding what we'd do. But then in 1948, the then Taoiseach, John A. Costello, was in Canada, and he announced that Ireland would soon become a republic. And this was surprising to a lot of people who hadn't expected it. And Ireland became a republic in 1949. In response, Britain passed the Ireland Act in June 1949, which gave Ireland's citizens a special status in the UK with no restriction rights to travel and work, and it states, that Ireland is not a foreign country for the purposes of any law and force in any part of the United Kingdom, which is actually, really great for Irish people who go and live and work in the United Kingdom, because it's so easy to do so. This Ireland Act, passed by Westminster as well, also contained an important note that, and if you recall, in contradiction to the Irish Constitution, which claimed the national territory as the entirety of the island of Ireland, the Ireland Act that the Westminster passed says, in no event will Northern Ireland cease to be part of His Majesty's dominions and of the UK without the consent of the Parliament of Northern Ireland. So those two, the Constitution and the UK Ireland Act, were in direct contradiction to each other. One other, on the name, I mean, a lot of people would call Ireland the Republic of Ireland, and that's the name of our football team. But given the name of our constitution, the name in our constitution is Ireland, or Éire, the official name of Ireland is Ireland. And you see that we often in our job would see in documents prepared for signature or for things like that, then sometimes the name Republic of Ireland creeps in, and we have to say, well, the official name is Ireland, so can you remove the Republic of, please? So yeah, that's something that sometimes is missed in these issues. So I also just want to touch on NATO membership because Ireland continues to be a militarily neutral country and not a member of NATO. And with the establishment of NATO in this period, it really caused the Irish authorities a challenge given its commitment to a mutual defence of all members, including the United Kingdom and by extension Northern Ireland. So for Ireland to join NATO, the argument was made that it would mean accepting that British military forces were stationed in Northern Ireland, and thus it mean accepting partition, which no Irish government was willing to do. And the foreign minister at the time, Sean McBride, indicated that to the United States government that Ireland would be willing to join if the US put pressure on the UK to end partition, which of course they didn't. So membership of the United Nations, this is so central to Irish foreign policy, membership of the United Nations. And in this time in the 1950s and 60s, a new foreign minister, Frank Aiken, was a very keen member or supporter of Ireland's membership of the UN, and knew that it was a really vital forum for small states, that we have an opportunity to voice our views, but also that the UN Charter set out a set of rules that states should follow, and those rules protect small states like Ireland, and so this was really central to Ireland's foreign policy, and sometimes our commitment to the rules annoyed states that Ireland was friendly with, and I think particularly during this period, it really underlined the independent mindedness of Irish foreign policy. To give some examples, around this time there was first example the China vote. So around this time there was an annual vote on the China vote, because the US insisted that the People's Republic of China be excluded from the China seat, and it would instead be held by the Republic of China in Taiwan. And in 1957, Ireland controversially voted in favour of holding a discussion in the General Assembly of who should hold the China seat. And that really caused anger in Washington and in Catholic circles around the United States, that Ireland, a Catholic country, would vote for a discussion on the admittance of a communist country to the China seat. And that really laid a line that Ireland would pursue, what it thought was right, in defence of the rules. Second, our role on nuclear non-proliferation is a subject and an area on which Ireland is rightly proud. In 1957, Aiken, the foreign minister, advocated for non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, and remember, these weapons did and still have the potential to destroy life on Earth. And every year thereafter, Ireland sought support for this Irish resolution on nuclear non-proliferation, and a version was finally passed in 1961. And it was a forerunner for what then became the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons that was agreed in 1968. And Aiken, the foreign minister, was invited to Moscow to be the very first signatory on the treaty that year, and that's a real keystone achievement for Irish foreign policy in Ireland. We were also a very strong voice on decolonisation at the time, given our own past, and in this regard, we supported decolonisation movements and took a very strong anti-apartheid stance against South Africa. And that sometimes caused a bit of friction with our partners like France and Portugal, who were undergoing decolonisation at the time and didn't necessarily appreciate Ireland's active approach on this issue. And then also peacekeeping is another area where we have a very long and proud tradition. We had our first peacekeeping force our contribution to a peacekeeping force in 1958, and we continue to do so, and we're the only country to have an unbroken record of involvement in peacekeeping initiatives from then until today, and it's a really defining element of our foreign policy. I would say that by the end of the 1960s, the UN was increasing in size somewhat as a result of decolonization, and the major powers were becoming more assertive in the United Nations, and this diluted Ireland's voice somewhat. I mean, the year before Ireland joined, there was 60 members of the UN. By 1969, it had 127 and 193 today. So we went from a relatively small group to tripling in size over that period. And but that said, I mean, the UN is still so important to our foreign policy, and we were a member of the Security Council from 1920 or from 2021 and 2022, and really worked hard there to defend the UN Charter, in line with and consistent with how we've always worked through the UN. Um, so just moving on to membership of the EU. By this period in the late 1950s, Ireland as an independent country wasn't really performing as we'd hoped. Like in many of the key indicators, we'd fallen behind in terms of living standards of much of Western Europe. The 30 years of Wirtschaftswunder had not happened in Ireland, and the policy of protectionism had meant that our industries were behind barriers. They weren't opening up to other markets um, and competition internationally. And it was very clear that our foreign policy needed to have an economic as well as a political imperative. And we had a new Taoiseach at this time. So Eamon de Valera retired and then became president of Ireland. And Sean Lemass, who had been part of de Valera's government, was also part of a newer, younger generation, and was keen to look again at Ireland's economic policy. There's also quite a famous civil servant who was Secretary General of the Department of Finance at that time, T.K. Whitaker, who was responsible for a report called Economic Development, and that really proposed an expansion of the Irish economy, not based on protectionism, but the opening of the Irish economy to trade and become less dependent on the UK. And I think Whitaker was really concerned with this independence project at the time, and is it actually successful? And he did say, in the political field, the primary national objective is the reunification of the country. Until that is achieved, however, and no doubt after it has been achieved, the principal economic problem of the Irish government will continue to be the safeguarding of political independence by ensuring economic vitality. Without a sound and progressive economy, political independence would be a crumbling facade. So he's really questioning, what was it all for, this war of independence, and if we can't provide for our own people. And if you recall, I mentioned at the beginning in 1961, the census showed that the Irish population had fallen to an all-time low. And I think during that period of the 1950s, almost 500,000 people left the country. So there's real questions over can we make a go of this independence? And um, and yeah, I mean, before I speak to that, because I think before I speak to the European Economic Community, um, I would say in this period we did open up our economy to new businesses and people coming in, and we did establish a free trade agreement with the UK, which increased trade and actually supported improving relations with Britain at this time as well. Actually, I have in one way economic development, uh, this new policy document, and opening up of Ireland's economy to thank for my own in my own life, because Faber-Castell, the famous German pencil and pen manufacturer, opened a plant in Fermoy in County Cork in the early 60s, and the grandfather of the person who would become my wife moved to Fermoy to run that factory at the time, and his daughter grew up there and married an Irish man, and their daughter is now my wife. So I have a personal connection to this opening up of the Irish economy as well in this period. But a key plank in this was was joining the EU and or EEC as it was, and we tried throughout the 1960s twice to join the EEC, along with Britain and Denmark, and Norway was also interested. Of course, the EU or EEC had already been established a number of years earlier, so we were coming a little bit late to the party, and so were the UK. But there was a real worry that the UK would join and Ireland wouldn't. And that would have like two major impacts. It would cut Ireland off from its main trading partner, but also reinforce partition. So there was very much a concern about that at the time. Ultimately, the French president Charles de Gaulle vetoed the British application, and so Ireland's application in 1961 went into cold storage. But that allowed the Irish economy to further develop, to build its free trade agreement with Britain, and to open up its trade to international competition. And it did help Ireland ultimately become more ready for membership, because when we joined, we were by far the poorest member of the EEC. In 1967, we tried again and again failed as de Gaulle vetoed it. And it wasn't until 1970, when de Gaulle was retired, that we were able to make progress and ultimately became a member in 1973, along with the UK and Denmark. Norway ultimately decided against it in a referendum. We did have a referendum as well, and there was a huge majority of 83% endorsed Ireland becoming a member of the European Economic Community. And I think that enthusiasm for membership continues today. And I also say, interestingly, for many people, that this 1973 marked, the culmination of the process of independence from Great Britain, because it really did help break that economic dependency on Britain, along with opening up of our economy, and it also helped expand our political horizons as well in a really important way. So joining the European Economic Community was really fundamental to Ireland's, some people would say, we became politically independent in 1922, but we didn't really become economically independent until 1973 and onwards. Maybe just to go back to the other part of the lecture on the economic side, I mean, the access to the European market really increased Ireland's attractiveness to foreign direct investment. It also resulted in huge fiscal transfers from Europe to Ireland through the Common Agricultural Policy, structural and cohesion funds. And they've been instrumental in transforming our economy and building our infrastructure and contributing to real growth and prosperity. And we were really proud in 2013 to finally, after then 40 years of membership, to no longer be a country that was in receipt of funding, but a country that was actually a contributor to the EU budget. In the late 80s and 90s, it was a really, while we did have strong economic growth, we also had high unemployment, and this led to, along with our foreign direct investment, a real emphasis, a renewed emphasis on our indigenous enterprises, or Irish-grown enterprises, and then these policies led to a real boom in Ireland, first in the Celtic Tiger, where we saw double-digit growth rates in the 1990s and the 2000s, but also a real growth in our domestic economy in that period between 2000 and 2007. Quite a lot of it driven by the housing market, growth in the housing market, which actually led to its own problems, and government expenditure was overly reliant on tax from the property sector, and when the global financial crisis in Ireland coincided with the property market,
I think Martin has left us, probably due to technical problems. Maybe to pass the time, we can talk a bit about what we've heard so far. What do people say
about. Oh, thank you, Frau Voran. Oh, there he is. Yeah.
Hi, sorry, I don't know what happened. I seem to have been booted out. Or
Okay, yeah, I just tried to phone you.
yeah. I'm sorry. I can continue where I left off if you tell
Yeah.
me, or do you need me to hurry up
Yes,
and finish?
a little bit. We have a couple of minutes, maybe, yeah, 2-3 minutes to finish. And
Yeah,
then we would get into the question phase. And we asked the students to already think about questions. So probably most of
yeah,
them have thought about questions. And we have 2 in the chat, actually.
okay,
So if you just kind of finalize everything, but
yeah.
if you have the problem again, just phone my number, which you should
Mm.
see your phone now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
It just timed out. It said to me. So anyway, I mean, look, I think maybe to come to a close on that. I mean, going back to the start of those 3 anniversaries, League of Nations, Europe, and Good Friday. I think they're 3 really interesting examples of Irish foreign policy where a real commitment to international law, the UN Charter, how a small state can operate in a world that's governed by rules and that doesn't allow for larger states to dominate or the interests of larger states to dominate, and gives a forum for smaller states to have a voice. And we see that through the EU as well, which allows a small state like Ireland to have a real voice in the EU, and also the EU being a real a really important um, avenue or vehicle for peace as well, not only in the continent of Europe, but also the context in which it provided to the Good Friday Agreement through the single market, which allowed for Ireland and Northern Ireland to have barrier-free trade with one another, and how important that was, and then the Good Friday Agreement itself and the importance of peace on the island of Ireland, and how that looks, and how that amplifies out globally, and the importance of peace generally for states to ensure peace and prosperity for their citizens. And that's why Ireland has been so forthright when it comes to Ukraine at the moment, and standing up for Ukraine and the rights and obligations of the international community in that regard. So maybe I'll just leave it there, because I think I might have gone a bit more longer than I anticipated. But I hope it was interesting, and happy to take any questions.
It definitely was. So thank you very much for this great talk, and we're happy to have you back, despite we had those technical problems. And now maybe we first have a look. Can you see that, the chat questions?
I can see one from Amy.
Yeah, I read out the first one to you. That's because you weren't here, so you cannot see it, but I read it out to you. It's quite short. It's a question by Leonie. She asks, how did Ireland's relation to Britain change after the Brexit, those especially to Northern Ireland?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. So one thing I would say is, when we look at where Ireland was um, in 1973, and our relations with Britain when we joined, I mean, we had a huge amount of trade with Britain, and not a lot with others. I have a stat somewhere about it, but we have well over half and almost 3/4 of our trade with Britain at that time was, or trade was with Britain at that time, and up to the earlier part of this century, it was still quite high. It was about 14% before Brexit, and now it's dropped down to about 7% of our exports that go to Britain. So, I think that Brexit has maybe accelerated some of the diversification of our trade and economic relations with Britain. Having said that, Britain is still a hugely important economic and political partner of Ireland. We respect the Brexit decision. I mean, this was a decision by the people of the United Kingdom to leave the EU, and that was their decision. Obviously, we were keen to ensure that that peace in Northern Ireland wasn't affected by the decision to leave the EU, and I think we've achieved that now. And I also would say, you know, in terms of relations with Britain, and I see it in the second question with Amy there already, you know, talking about her grandfather who emigrated from Ireland to Manchester. You know, there's a huge Irish community in Britain still, and you know, also a lot of people from Britain come to Ireland to live, to work, to go on holidays, and we often, you know, we watch many of the same TV shows. I'm a big Manchester United fan, so we do continue to have a really strong affinity with Britain as well. And so, you know, I think of course Brexit has caused challenges and so on, but I think you know, that relationship is quite, it's quite a lot healthier than it was maybe 100 years ago, for sure. So.
Okay, thank you. We have another question in the chat. That's by Simone. What strategies could help reduce the accommodation crisis in Ireland and improve the situation?
Yeah, so I mean, yes, of course, like many other countries, and I see it here in Berlin as well, it's so difficult to find accommodation and so expensive, and Ireland has some of those challenges as well, and it can be, and I guess, you know, some of the challenges arise from that growing population, and we've seen that in the census, and ensuring that the housing stock catches up with the population growth. I mean, the government has been really keen to prioritize this issue, you know, over the last period, and expanding the social housing stock, expanding the incentives and the economic assistance for people to buy houses, as well, and particularly first-time buyers, people who haven't already bought a house. And I think what we need to do now is to, you know, ensure that those policies which are backed by large scale funding are delivered upon in the next few years, to ensure that you know, people are able to get a house and to have that security. So I think that's where we are. It's a case of delivering now on the policies and utilizing the funds that we've set aside to address this accommodation challenge.
Yes, great, thank you. Do you want to come back to, well, you partly answered Amy's question.
Yeah, sorry, I haven't read it properly in full. I just started. So he's arrested by police, and his brother had to go. Yeah, I don't. So the question is, was Amy's grandfather arrested during the Second World War in Manchester as a result of Ireland's position of neutrality? I'm not sure, to be honest, but it could have been for any reason, to be honest. I'm not sure. If I don't think that Irish people would have been arrested in Britain for Irish positions of neutrality. So yeah, I don't. Yeah.
Sorry, Martin, but he was arrested in Ireland. He was arrested in
He's arrested in Ireland. Oh, so he'd
for wearing an RAF uniform in Ireland.
Oh, sorry, I misread. There we go. Maybe so then. Maybe just, yeah, maybe it had something to do with it. May have seemed unusual for somebody to have been walking around in an RAF uniform in Ireland at that time. Yeah.
Thanks.
But I don't know exactly, but it's possible. Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question, yes, by Max. How does Ireland support other small island states threatened by climate change? What is Ireland's overall climate policy strategy?
Yeah, so we have a small island developing state strategy, which was launched in 2019 and updated recently, and that really emphasizes Ireland's affiliation as a small island state ourselves, or as we call ourselves when we talk to and other small island states call themselves when we speak to each other, not small island states, but large ocean states. Ireland's sea area is about 7 times that of our land area, which makes us actually, if you count land and sea, one of the largest countries in the EU. So we have this affinity with small island states, and it's, you know, we have this policy which sets out that these countries who have done the least to cause climate change are actually most exposed and most vulnerable to its effects, and as a result, and in line with our overall development policy, we set out to reach those who are most who in, you know, when you talk about the sustainable development goals, are the furthest behind, and we see those in small island states in this regard. So we, maybe to tie that in with the overall climate policy strategy in terms of our climate finance, the finance that we provide to developing countries, we gave about 100 million euros in climate finance in 2021, but we have an ambition to get to 225 million euros of climate of funding in climate finance per year by 2025, and that climate finance will be directed towards those most vulnerable countries, including small island states. And actually, when we were on the Security Council in recent years, you know, we had I believe many small island developing states had voted for Ireland to become a member of that, and we were really conscious of that during our Security Council tenure, and for that reason, we brought a resolution to the Security Council on climate change, which was ultimately vetoed by Russia, unfortunately, despite widespread support. Our overall climate policy strategy, I mean, we want to reduce our emissions by 51% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. We've got a huge offshore wind potential, and we're working to deliver that, as well as our onshore and solar ambitions over the coming years to achieve our targets. I'm happy to say more about that, but I see there's another question and time is running short.
Yes, maybe the last question now by Heiner. Did the ongoing war in Ukraine change or inspire discussions about Ireland joining NATO?
Yeah, I mean, the war in Ukraine has led to discussions in many places around NATO membership, most obviously in Sweden and Finland, who subsequently joined NATO in the aftermath of the Russian aggression and war in Ukraine. I mean, in terms of us joining NATO, I mean, there's no plans to join NATO at the moment. We do cooperate with NATO through their partnership for peace, and that allows us to select priorities for cooperation. What I would say, and might be interesting for students who have a real interest in this area, I mean, partly as a result of the Russian continued invasion of Ukraine, we'll run the Taoiseach Minister for Foreign Affairs and Defence has announced a consultative forum on security policy this summer, and it's going to be taking place in June. June 22nd to 27th, I think, and that's aiming to build a deeper understanding of the threats faced by the state and the links between our foreign security and defence policy. And I understand that that's going to, you know, and that's in the context of this new security environment in Europe, and it will allow the Irish public to engage on these questions of security and defence and so on. But I believe that's going to be streamed online. So if Heiner, if you are interested in this area, then if you go to Consultative Forum Security and Defence Ireland on Google, you should find a link to the public consultation, and and be able to follow those discussions over the course of June and to get a better insight into this. But specifically to answer your question, no, there's no plans to join NATO at the moment.
Okay. Thank you very much, Martin. First of all, for your intriguing, very convincing talk, but also for answering all the questions. It was great having you here, even though it was just online, but I think it's still a great tool so that many people can join and you don't have to travel. And we might meet in July because you're here in Würzburg and everybody can actually join. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. And we'll have an exhibition there as well. I see Eva Maria was on the call at some point. So yeah, oh yeah, she's still there. So yeah, please share the information if you can, and I look forward to doing it then. Auf Deutsch, which is going to be a real test for me, and hopefully not for the audience.
Yeah, we're all looking forward to meeting you there. So thank you very much. Have a good time till then. And bye, everybody, also to my students and colleagues. Bye-bye.